thing we have to fear is
in war,
fear itself.
there is no substitute for victory.
Let us never negotiate out of fear.
We stand undivided, forever united, fighting hand in hand for the liberty we've earned, for glory and honor, for our sons and daughters, ever mindful of the lessons we've learned. Let the torch of freedom burn.
Thomas Jefferson said, "In questions of power, then let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down for mischief by the chains of the Constitution."
And that's why we do Foundations of Freedom Thursday. We're learning about those founding principles so we can bind those leaders down with the change of the Constitution and the jurisdictions that government should adhere to. I'm Rick Green here with David Barton and Tim Barton, and we're going to be talking about those foundations of freedom today. Guys, we often talk about specific clauses in the Declaration or Constitution. Sometimes we go to a principle that is being debated in our culture today. One of those principles, we're going to get a question on this one today, but it has to do with even the idea of truth itself. Did the founders believe in moral absolutes and truths?
That's going to be an easy one to answer, and it'll be a fun one to answer. They did believe in moral absolutes and truths, and by the way, I don't know of anyone who doesn't believe in moral absolutes and truths. Even if they disagree with traditional moral absolutes and truths, they're adamantly set against it. So those who reject traditional marriage absolutely, unequivocally believe that homosexual marriage is moral. And so, it's not a question of absolute truths. It's what are your absolute truths and how do you measure them and where do you get them from?
Well, and it's not a question of even morality, as a lot of people think about in a sense of what is moral and what's not. Everybody has as a standard of morality. It's just whose morality are we going to follow? Everybody has a religion. Whose religion are we going to follow? And so the founding fathers upheld that the highest standard, the highest level of morality was biblical truth. And what the Bible, what God presents as the best way to do things, we understand that there are consequences for doing the right things and the wrong things. And this is what we have seen across societies, what we've seen across cultures, what the founding fathers explained, and even the Declaration when they talked about the laws of nature and of nature's God. That God had outlined things that you can look at creation, you can look at his word, and you can see there are certain things that are right and certain things that work and certain things that are wrong and certain things that don't work.
And one of the things that Tim just mentioned is the standard they used. They announced that standard in the Declaration of Independence as incorporated in the Constitution. It's called the laws of nature, nature's God. That became the common law of the Seventh Amendment of the Constitution. But in the Declaration, they point out that what they are doing is because of the standard raised by the laws of nature, nature's God. And people don't necessarily know what that standard is. They don't understand it. But it comes out of the most popular law book of their day. Every one of those guys knew exactly what that phrase was and where it came from. And it's a very significant phrase. It came from Blackstone's Commentaries on the Law, and it established the basis of morality in a very reasonable, very rational manner. And it did so in such a way that even evolutionists would have a hard time arguing against it, and that is natural law and natural process. And so, and by the way, the basis for this for biblical folks, for Christians, is what Paul says in Romans 1. And what he says in Romans 1 is everything that can be known about God is revealed through what he's created, so that even heathen without excuse. So everything that you can know about God is revealed in natural law. And from natural law, you get all sorts of standards of right and wrong. Now, because sometimes our human understanding gets messed up, that's where God also came in, and the founders and Blackstone point out that you have natural law, but God supplements that by also giving us what are called the laws of nature's God, the laws of the God who gave us nature, and that's things like the Ten Commandments. Whereas murder does occur in nature, God says, well, murder is not to occur between human beings. And so that moral law encompasses the laws of nature and the laws of nature's God. And that was the moral standing that they used.
Well, it seems to have worked well. I mean, it gave us a successful culture and a successful nation. But today, we tend to think, well, it's every man for himself. Everybody comes up with their own law, their own concept of right and wrong. What did the founders say about that, just leaving it up to each other?
Well, that's one of the things that the Bible talks about 3 times, is every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And when you get to that standard of doing what's right in your own eyes, then you really get into a system where that John Quincy Adams described it as the law of the tiger and the shark. It's my view is right because I've got a magazine with 30 rounds in it and yours only has 20 rounds in it. And my view is right because I'm actually shooting, you're shooting a little 22, but I'm shooting a 50 caliber. And so it is the law of the tiger and the shark who has the more physical force to enforce their view. And that's what you get into. And that's what nations around the world have. That's what leads to revolutions, is when everyone gets to set their own standard of right and wrong.
But it also goes back to the idea of why the Founding Fathers were against a democracy, is because how many times the Founding Fathers talk about the heart of man, that you can't trust it. We can't put all the power in one place. The reason that we had power really dispersed between three different but equal branches is because we didn't want to centralize power, because the heart of man, but even the same notion of democracy, that you can't give man the ability to do whatever he wants to do, in the sense that even in a democracy, we understood, and by the way, they were obviously against the democracy, but even by giving people the freedom to choose, they could not choose against God's moral code or moral standard.
And that's a great point, Tim, because in a democracy, it'd just be, well, if something is now fun and faddish and popular, then that would be the law of the land. Whereas with a republic, you're saying there's a rule of law that actually trumps what feels good in whatever way the wind's blowing in the culture that day, because it stands on those timeless principles of truth.
Yeah, and the other thing that goes with this whole concept of right and wrong, and going back to the laws of nature, is if you take something like in nature, there are 10 million species at minimum. Some say up to 15 million. But if you take the 10 million species of both animal and insect species, one of the things that the laws of nature teaches you, and this doesn't matter whether you believe in evolution or creation, is there is no species in nature that kills its young while it's still in the womb. So abortion violates all natural process. You don't need God to know that. You don't need the Bible to know that. That's the way nature teaches you. You have the same thing with homosexuality. Out of those 10 million species, there is a handful, I mean literally 2 or 3 species that do have some homosexuality, but it is never a lifestyle. And it is always an aberration even in that society. I mean, it would be. Otherwise, they could never reproduce and keep the species alive. So there is nothing in nature to sustain that. I don't need the Bible to say that. I don't need religious faith. I don't need God to say that. I say that's a violation of the laws of nature. And I don't care whether you believe in evolution or creation. It violates all natural law. And so that is part of the standard is, that there's just some things that you have. The right to self-defense is a natural law. You can't legislate it. I can't say that my horse doesn't have the right to kick somebody in the head if they come mess with her foal. That's part of the nature. That's part of the nature of what nature is. That is a law of nature. So when the founders talked about the laws of nature, those aren't things that human law can change. But the laws of nature's God, that's where faith comes into it. But that just affirms what nature already teaches us. So that's the moral stand, and that is higher than any vote. You can have a vote in Congress that by a margin of 97-3, we've decided that horses shouldn't kick people in the head if they get too close to the foal. Well, you can pass that law you want to. It won't change the behavior of that horse to defend its young, because that is part of the laws of nature.
We've got a question for Foundation Freedom Thursday today that is on another area of moral absolutes and truths and how the law should reflect that. We'll be right back. Stay with us here on WallBuilders Live.
George Washington. The Constitution approaches nearer to perfection than any other government hitherto instituted among men.
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. Often today, it seems that the federal government has become too intrusive into local matters, and federal micromanagement has now unfortunately become the norm in education, law enforcement, religious expressions, and even on what is and is not moral. Strikingly, the Founding Fathers had intended that the federal government never intrude into any of these issues. As Thomas Jefferson explained, taking from the states the moral rule of their citizens and subordinating it to the federal government would break up the foundations of the Union. I believe the states can best govern our home concerns and the federal government our foreign ones. According to Thomas Jefferson, the original plan was for the federal government to direct foreign affairs, but for the states and local communities to direct the domestic and the moral ones.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Samuel Adams said, "The liberties of our country and the freedom of our civil constitution are worth defending against all hazards, and it is our duty to defend them against all attacks."
Welcome back to WallBuilders Live. It's Foundations of Freedom Thursday. Rick Green here, back with David Barton and Tim Barton. And guys, we got a question from one of our listeners. She says, it's Madison Smith. She says, I have a question about explaining to people who don't believe in God or have a Christian faith base why homosexual marriage is wrong. If you don't fear God or believe in God's law, then there's nothing wrong with homosexuality in their eyes. It makes sense to us who believe in God's law why it would be wrong. But how do we explain it to people who are not people of faith?
That's a good question, Rick. It's one that being in ministry, I was a youth pastor for 10 years and did a lot of stuff, a lot of kids camps, and we tend to hear these kind of questions fairly often. And a lot of times we fail to evaluate things correctly. We fail to measure things the right way, where we tend to, even as Christians, we tend to try to argue what the Bible says instead of just using a very simple measurement that Jesus gave us in Matthew 7 when he says, just judge a tree by its fruits. And if all we did is look at what things produce and use that as a measurement of good idea, bad idea, it would certainly change a lot of the way we think and a lot of the ways that we operate related to certain things. Just for instance, if you just took the issue of welfare, good idea, bad idea, well, let's just measure what it's produced. Has it really been beneficial? And more times than not, you see it's been a negative thing more than a positive thing. Well, all you have to do is look at what something produces, is the measurement that Jesus gave us. And if all we did is talk about the benefits, the pros and the cons of what a certain action or decision or choice was, then it's a pretty easy measurement based on the fruit that you are seeing produced to go, you know what, this isn't a very good idea. And if we look at homosexuality in the same light and just say, okay, what is it producing? And just measure what it produces, and you compare it to a heterosexual relationship, it's a pretty easy measurement to make.
And jumping on that, there's a lot of stats out there. Now, I would call them suppressed stats, not in the sense that they're not readily available. They are. They're just suppressed in the sense that most folks in the media will not talk about them and most don't cover them. But let me go to one of the very right-wing religious conservative organizations in America, and that's the Center for Disease Control. And obviously I say that tongue-in-cheek because there's no way that's a religious group or a right-wing group or a conservative group or the Federal Food and Drug Administration. Do you know that currently they have a ban on homosexuals being able to give blood? Let me just read to you off their website. Men who have sex with other men cannot donate blood because they have an HIV prevalence 60 times higher than the general population, 800 times higher than first-time blood donors, and 8,000 times higher than repeat blood donors. That's statistics from the American Red Cross. They also, I'm still reading, they also have an increased risk of having other infections that can be transmitted to others by blood transfusion. For example, infection with hepatitis B virus is about 5 to 6 times more common, and hepatitis C virus infections are about 2 times more common in men who have sex with men than in the general population. So, first off, from a health standpoint, we've already said, whoa, men who have sex with men, this is such a lifestyle that creates such health problems for everyone else that we don't let these guys give blood. Now, continue. You have homosexuals. They are less than 3% of the population, and they account for 63% of all syphilis cases. Continuing on, I'm still reading from Food and Drug Administration. Men who have sex with other men represent approximately 2% of the U.S. population, yet they are the most severely affected by HIV. In 2010, they accounted for 61% of all new infections in the United States, and an estimated 77% of diagnosed infections were between men who had sex with men. Now, let me tell you what that means. Another government area, that diagnosis in that year now means that the federal government will spend an additional $19.9 billion to treat just the folks infected with HIV last year, primarily homosexual males. And so we're going to spend another $19.9 billion, And by the way, it turns out that one of the biggest ticket items in health care and Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera, is treatment of HIV. That's the most expensive out there, and that is a voluntary behavior that comes from men having sex with men. It continues to say that while men who have sex with men, HIV incidence increased 12%, it decreased in every other population. The only increase in HIV/AIDS was with men who had sex to men, and particularly there's a massive increase in those between the ages of 13 and 24. Now, if I just keep, and I can read you a lot more stats like that, I can show you many more stats. When we see stats like that, if this were tobacco, we would be suing the tobacco companies. If this were anything else, we would be saying this kind of behavior, man, you can't let kids get caught with this kind of behavior. And so purely from a secular standpoint, because every year we're adding another $20 billion in medical care that the government's going to have to bear, because these folks infect others at a higher rate. And by the way, we have all of these instances of homosexual men saying, it's not fair for me to be discriminated against giving blood. I'm giving blood anyway. Guess what? They put the rest of the population in jeopardy when they do so, all because they want to make a political statement. So, Bible aside, tell me what part of that does not constitute a health risk that for any logical thinking person, they would say this is not a good deal for society.
And as someone who's a teacher, I still work with a lot of people that are teachers, and one of their concerns is, we've got these kids that are 14 and 15, and we look at them, and they genuinely, I have teachers tell me they're really gay, and they think they're gay, and they're being suppressed. And one of the things I challenge the teachers with is, wait a second, are you telling me if you had a kid who is being offered heroin and he's choosing heroin that you can't tell him, hey man, what you're doing, I love you and I support you and I believe in you, but what you're doing is going to ultimately be very destructive to your body, and it will not be beneficial for you in the long run. And we act like we cannot talk about the consequences of the act of homosexuality because, well, it's someone's lifestyle and that's their choice. How is that different than any other choice? This is something, and I understand there's a lot of people, there's probably even people listening to us right now that are going, well, that's not really their choice. And, well, what in our life do we not have a choice to do? Even I am a married heterosexual man. I choose every time that I'm intimate with my wife or not. I can choose. My body does not control me. I choose, and I intentionally choose to not do things that are going to harm me, that are not beneficial for me. But see, this only confirms what the Bible already teaches. What we see from the effects of these actions and behavior, it confirms the standard that God has, and it goes back to just a simple measurement of what does it produce and is it working? And if all we did was measure how is it working out, is this something that we want to promote and encourage based on the results, there's no way that we would promote and encourage homosexuality.
So can you take the same approach to this that guys like Benjamin Franklin did from the standpoint of, he wasn't a professing Christian, but he saw the results that the Christian faith produced, and so he still wanted society to abide by those outlines, those rules, those concepts of right and wrong. So even though he personally didn't believe that way, he could see the practical effects. In the same way, in terms of a policy, I mean, the practical effects, you guys just laid it out. It's obvious. So is that the way to explain it to someone that you say, hey, you may not believe in the Bible, may not be for what the Bible says to do, so just forget the fact that that's where this truth comes from and just recognize that it is a truth, that this is a lifestyle that hurts people.
It is a natural law, that's for sure. I mean, it's a violation of natural law, and a lot of secular folks are into natural law, and they want natural law in politics, etc. So it's a natural law. Second is, statistically, from purely secular sources, it is a harmful lifestyle, not only for themselves, but for those around them. And third is, we've just been finishing this week, literally, going through, now we've been talking about homosexuality, but now you can take that to homosexual marriage. Now, if homosexuality is bad, does it get okay when you get in marriage? And there are now, I think when we initially did the study about a decade ago, there were a dozen countries that allowed gay marriage. It's now up to 36 countries that have homosexual marriage. And so those that have had it the longest have the more stats. And as you look at the more stats that are out there on homosexual marriage, you find that across the board in these countries, the societal consequences have not been good, that you're taking, in the case of Americans, about as the the Centers for Disease Control and Federal Drug Administration said about 2% of the population. You're changing the definition of marriage for 2% of the population. We're finding that in other nations you have it's single digits of homosexuals who actually marry. So let's say it's 10% of the population. So you're taking 2% of the population, and 10% of that 2% is going to marry. So we are changing the entire structure of marriage in America for 0.2% of the nation. Really? Would we do that for any other group? Would we say we're going to change the entire societal structure because 0.2% want something different? And then, by the way, you're finding that in the nations like Netherlands, who've had it the longest, that homosexuals are moving away from marriage at all. I mean, it's had a 50% drop over the last 8 years in Netherlands of homosexuals getting married. They don't care about marriage anymore. And we saw even last week with homosexual conferences here in America they say gay marriage is only a step to our objective of ultimately abolishing all marriage. So they're very open about we want marriage gone. Yeah. And homosexual marriage is just a step in that direction.
Yeah, we got to take a quick break, guys. When we come back, let's talk about what people, if they're looking at this as a foundational issue in society, what does that mean in terms of our laws? And if we continue to go down this road of marriage being redefined the way that it is, what will be the result in our country? Ryan Anderson has that book where he talks about this never happened before the year 2000 in any culture, any society, anywhere. Did they ever think of homosexuality as a marriage issue and changing the definition of marriage even for these acts? Marriage was always viewed as conjugal marriage. So let's talk about the law effect when we come back. Stay with us, folks. You're listening to WallBuilders Live.
Calvin Coolidge said, "The more I study the Constitution, the more I realize that no other document devised by the hand of man has brought so much progress and happiness to humanity. To live under the American Constitution is the greatest political privilege that was ever accorded to the human race."
Have you ever wanted to learn more about the United States Constitution but just felt like, man, the classes are boring, or it's just that old language from 200 years ago, or I don't know where to start? People want to know, but it gets frustrating because you don't know where to look for truth about the Constitution either. Well, we've got a special program for you available now called Constitution Alive with David Barton and Rick Green, and it's actually a teaching done on the Constitution at Independence Hall in the very room where the Constitution was framed. We take you both to Philadelphia, the cradle of liberty in Independence Hall, and to the WallBuilders Library, where David Barton brings the history to life to teach the original intent of our founding fathers. We call it the Quick Start Guide to the Constitution because in just a few hours through these videos, you will learn the Citizen's Guide to America's Constitution. You'll learn what you need to do to help save our constitutional republic. It's fun, it's entertaining, and it's going to inspire you to do your part to preserve freedom for future generations. It's called Constitution Alive with David Barton and Rick Green. You can find out more information on our website now at wallbuilders.com.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
President Thomas Jefferson said, "I know no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society, but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education. This is the true corrective of abuses of constitutional power."
Welcome back to WallBuilders Live, Foundations of Freedom Thursday. We've been talking about the issue of homosexual marriage. And guys, in terms of a law issue, if this is going to damage society, then where do we draw the line? I mean, what and how do we explain that to those that are not people of faith?
Well, I'm going to go from a reverse perspective. The traditional model from the beginning of time has been a man and a woman in a lifetime union. That is certainly the model that you find in Genesis. That is what Jesus himself reiterated in Matthew 19. Lifelong union of a man and a woman. By the way, Wikipedia, very secular source. Wikipedia says the image of the traditional family is rooted in what they call creation myths. So this myth, this traditional family thing goes back to the myth of Adam and Eve in the garden. Nonetheless, that's what it's been for 5,500 years in the Western world and most of the Eastern world. So what we know is that any arrangement other than that, and it doesn't have to be homosexual marriage, it can be single moms without a father in the home, it can be divorced parents, single father, single mother, doesn't matter what sex it is. What we do know is that anytime you don't have a mother and a father in the home, it doesn't matter if it's 2 men, 2 women, doesn't matter if it's 1 man, 1 woman, doesn't matter what the arrangement is, anytime you don't have that, kids suffer. And so we're writing a book on this right now, and all the recent stats, we have the most recent studies, but educational scores of those kids are lower. They're almost twice likely to repeat a grade. They're twice likely to be suspended or expelled from school. The young men are twice as likely to end up in jail. They're 7 times more likely to be delinquents. They're twice as likely to have pulled a gun or knife from somebody in the past year. Gang involvement is twice as high. 90% of the violent crime over the last 3 decades committed by those raised in a home without a mother and a father. I mean, just keep going. The stats are very clear that the only arrangement that produces healthy culture, healthy society, religion aside, just a good culture to live in, is a lifelong union of a man and a woman.
And Rick, that goes to the point that ultimately what we need to do is stop trying to measure the uniqueness of an idea and start measuring the effectiveness of the idea. With this issue of homosexuality, a lot of people like the idea. Well, what is the result of that idea? What's the effectiveness? And it's not very good.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Thanks for listening, folks. You've been listening to WallBuilders Live.
Abraham Lincoln said, "We the people are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution."
We stand undivided.